with Heart to Heart, brought to you by Cardiac Insight. And today we're going to continue our conversation with Dr. Hadley. He is the CTO of Cardiac Insight and developer of Cardea 2020 and Cardea SOLO, a life-changing device.
Thank you, Dani. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the pleasure is all ours. We have a lot to dive into.
Go for it.
But first, you have such an impressive background. I need to know all about Dr. Hadley.
It's a bit of a crazy story. I finished a PhD at Caltech back in the 70s. A colleague and I were still graduate students at the time. I was at the seismological laboratory at Caltech and studying geophysics primarily, but with a focus on seismology, earthquakes, which is a bit of a distance from cardiology,
Right.
I suppose. We started our first company while we were still graduate students, much to the dismay of the department. And we focused on services, consulting services around seismics. We did a lot of work for the Department of Defense with the goal of helping put in place a nuclear test ban treaty. Russians were setting off explosions in complex geologic basins and triggering earthquakes. And the goal was, can we see how big the explosion was, and is it within the restrictions of the nuclear test ban treaty? Sometimes the explosions would actually trigger an earthquake, so we were looking a lot at waveform analysis. Can we separate out the explosive part from the earthquake part? And then they were setting them off in complex basins, and so we needed to do a lot of modeling of wave propagation in complex geologies. We also did work for a nuclear power plant, Southern California San Onofre plant. We did a lot of work on simulating strong ground motions in order to validate that the design spectra for the plant was sufficient. We continued to do those consulting services for a while and then found that the oil and gas industry was quite interested in our ability to model complex geologies and model wave propagation through those basins as they did their seismic surveys. So we transitioned the company into a software company. So we grew the company up to a little over 100 people. We were acquired by a major oil field service business. And we stayed on for a while, and then both Bob and I went on our way. Mm-hmm. Bob ended up working for Bill Gates in the health area, and I've ended up in cardiology. So it's crazy.
Well, there has to be some correlation between the two, and I know we're going to
Probably.
get into that, but how fascinating is that you both ended up in the health industry
Yeah.
after studying earthquakes and
Right.
building softwares?
So I was recruited into a grand old ECG company called Quinton. Wayne Quinton formed the company. He was at UW, and he partnered with Dr. Bruce, and they built the first stress treadmill system for treadmill testing,
Okay.
and a whole suite of cardiographs and so forth. So I was recruited to rebuild the engineering team and rebuild the suite of products. I didn't know much about cardiology at the time, in fact, very little, but I knew quite a bit about waveform analysis, signal processing, managing engineering groups, and a bit of experience with hardware systems as well. So I stayed at Quinton for quite a while. We did a couple of acquisitions. One of them was a company called Cardiac Science. So if people are walking around the airports and they see a defibrillator that would be labeled Cardiac Science, that was one of our products at the time. So about 2007, I actually retired. I've been doing cardiology at that point for 10 plus years. Dr. Foliker and I had been working closely together. He was one of our consultants. And when I retired, then Vic and I started just collaborating together doing papers. Vic's really a grand old guy in ECG world. He's written several books, and I've lost count. I bet he's published 600 papers at this point.
Wow.
Yeah, he's really an amazing guy. So Vic and I were continuing to have fun doing papers and conferences and so forth. And about 2010, Vic does all the cardiovascular screening for the incoming Stanford athletes for risk of sudden cardiac arrest. And he's also does that for the San Francisco 49ers. So as we were talking, Vic says, the ECG devices that I'm using for screening young athletes really aren't designed for our needs. They have very high false positive rates, and they're designed for older people, people in their 60s, 70s that are having heart attacks and so forth. And the false positive rates were 15 to 25%. So if you test 4 or 5 kids and one of them is marked as abnormal, then you have to go through a large amount of additional testing. Scares everybody, you can imagine. And the cardiac world had turned its back on using ECGs for screening kids for risk. There's still a lot of cardiologists who haven't gotten over that yet. But with the work we've done, we've gotten that down to about 2%, and I'll come back to that. But anyway, I told Vic, I thought the research on what we should be looking for would be really interesting, and we should do that. I wasn't sure the world needed another cardiograph. There was lots of them out there. So Vic's launched an effort to bring together cardiologists, particularly sports-related cardiologists, U.S. and internationally. And we put together a paper on criteria for screening young people. That was published in one of the leading heart journals, or a publication called Circulation, in 2011. The editors gave us a really nice review, and they encouraged us to continue to do this work. One of the co-authors on that paper was Dr. Dresner, John Dresner. John's at UW, and John has become the poster boy for this. I'll talk more about that in a moment. But about the same time the paper came out, I attended a conference at Stanford on sudden death in young people. And at the end of it, I went up to Vic and said, okay, I get this. Let's see what we can do. Let's try to make something that's really simple to use so that mass screenings can happen without needing 100 cardiologists. That could be used by a wide range of people, and it had really good sensitivity and accuracy. So Vic and I pooled our minimal resources, and I hired some guys that I've worked with before. We built the device that we now call Cardea 2020.
Yeah.
And we got it through the FDA in about 2013. And then we were off to the races to sell and promote the product.
And what an incredible product you have.
It's been fun to do. Yeah, we've taken the false positive rate. I hate to call it false positive anymore because we're finding things in these young people that may affect them over the arc of their life. They may not fall over,
Right.
but having a baseline ECG is important for them.
Right.
But our false positive rate of 2% is consistent with the sudden death that we see in young people. Men are about twice as likely to die suddenly as women. African Americans are much more likely, about twice as likely as Caucasians. And it's also stratified by sport. So our 2%, the women are about 1%, and the men are 2.5%, and the African American population is slightly higher. So
Why do you think?
I think that's a great question. I think there's just some genetic issues that predispose people slightly differently. I just think that's a great question. Not everybody knows that. Dr. Dresner convened 2 groups in Seattle over a period of a couple of years, and he brought in many of the people that were on our Circulation article, sometimes called the Stanford criteria. But John brought in a larger group. We had a series of meetings and reviewed all the clinical evidence that we had on what are the criteria, and we upgraded the Stanford criteria to what became known as the Seattle criteria. We went through 2 iterations of that, and then John led a group with the international people contributing more, and that's now matured into the international consensus criteria.
That's amazing. Can you explain a little bit
Sure.
about what the criteria kind of consists of and how you came to the consensus of getting that criteria?
Right. Well, the criteria looks at all sorts of different shapes of the waveform that is recorded on the heart. On a standard 12-lead ECG, we put 10 wires on the person's chest, and out of that we derive this electrical picture of the heart. And from every angle, it has slightly different shapes to the wiggles. And so the amplitude of those wiggles, the width of the wiggles, the interrelationship, all of that contains information about the heart. So in some ways it's not unlike earthquakes. All of the different waveform shapes tell you something about the source, and that's absolutely true for the heart. And we went through a lot of things that were giving false positives, and we clinically looked at, are those things that really are causing the death, or are those not really associated with
Right.
kids dying? And so out of that came a consensus of what were the important things to look for. Yeah.
So it narrows it down
Quite a
lot
bit.
more.
Yeah. So it makes it practical to screen kids.
Right.
Yeah.
And then one thing that I really loved about that is that you're eliminating that step where they're going to get all these other tests done
Yes.
and putting them underneath the stresses.
Yes.
Oh my gosh, am I going to have to
Right.
stop
It's very
this
stressful for the kids.
doing what I love, playing sports, and,
Right.
and it might
Right.
not even be to that level.
Yes. It is stressful, but having talked to mothers who have lost a child, they would do anything to wind that clock back.
Yeah.
So it's...
Well, that's so important. You're changing lives. You're saving lives.
We are saving lives. I know
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
Yeah,
we are.
so I'm sure, and we just need a lot more awareness of this. Hopefully, with our conversation, we can bring some more awareness. And I know you guys are working on lots of other projects.
Right.
We're going to get to that. But I want to go back because you had mentioned something, and I think it's really fascinating with your background. Tell me what the similarities are between earthquake waves
Okay.
and your heartbeat waves.
Okay.
'Cause that's your background.
Yes.
Originally.
Sure. Okay. Try to make this not too complicated. You can imagine an earthquake when the earth starts to move. So the faces of the rock, if you look at, say, just one little spot on the rock, is that rupture comes by, that little spot goes from at rest to suddenly, boom, it's moving.
Mm-hmm.
And then as the earthquake terminates, that moving particles or piece of rock starts to slow down and ultimately stop. So we have a signal that's very abrupt, and then there's a sliding as the earthquake continues, and then there's a stopping phase. That looks almost exactly like the ion potential in a myocardial cell. So that's the electrical signal that comes out of the heart. And then there's something we call Green's functions, and that just means how do you take the signal at the heart and move it to the surface of the skin. And in the earth, we have the same thing. We have Green's functions of how do I move the waveform through the earth and to the recorders. So I have found that the ECG waveforms and seismology have a lot in common.
Yeah.
In fact, it's funny because I think when the ECGs were first starting to be recorded over 100 years ago, it was about the same time that seismology was getting started. And in seismology, we have P waves, and then we have S waves, and then there's some other waves that are actually called T waves. And so what do we have in ECG? We have P wave, QRS, and a T. So they were even named the same.
Wow.
And in a near field recording of an earthquake looks a whole lot like an ECG. It's really amazing. Yeah. So it's been super helpful.
I mean, when you think about like our planet like that, and when you're talking about that, all I can think of is these earthquakes. It's like the heartbeat of Earth, or like sending signals to the residents on planet Earth that, and the same with the heart.
Right.
That's so fascinating. That blows my mind, really. And then you just applied that into your next field.
Yeah. It's very transferable, and waveform analysis, signal processing, databasing, that's common. So it's been fun.
I love that. I love that how you transitioned into that, and it really is so relatable to both. So okay, now you've partnered up with Vic, and you came up with Cardea Solo, right?
No, we came up first with 2020.
2020.
Yes,
okay.
that's the device we use for screening the kids.
Okay.
Yeah.
And let's talk about that, because right now we're seeing sudden deaths in athletes.
I think we're more aware of it too than
More
we used to
aware.
be. Yeah. When a kid dies as he makes the basketball at the end of the game, everybody knows about that. But a youngster that dies on a pickup game may not even make the news. And some of the athletes die in their sleep. There are some conditions that predispose death while you're at sleep. And those are completely lost. So there's a really growing awareness of the problem. In the past, when people have tried to estimate the probability of death, they've come into a community and they tried to estimate how many kids were in the community. And then they would scan the newspapers and try to find every reference to a sudden unexpected death. And from that, try to say, okay, out of 100,000 kids in 1 year, 3 might die or whatever the number might be. But of course, they didn't really estimate the population very well. And a whole lot of the kids that were dying were never accounted for. So the numbers were all over the map. And of course, in NCAA, we know every player, we know gender, what sport they're in, their ethnicity. And when we know if they died, we have a complete workup on them. So Dr. Harmon did this great study, and she found the death rates were dramatically higher than the traditional cardiologists had thought. And she's the one that found that they were stratified by ethnicity, gender, and sport. So a young African-American player has about, if I remember right, about 1 in 12,000 chance of death per year of play. And you think, well, he probably played high school ball and college ball, maybe ultimately professional. His chances of dying are better than 1 in 1,000. So how many of us would risk our life for that chance? So I think there's just now a huge awareness of this. NCAA Division I think just about every basketball player now is screened, not only electrically, but also with ultrasound to look at things that may not have electrical signature, but can also cause sudden death. Yeah.
Do you think it's awareness, or do you also feel like maybe there was a little bit of controversy behind not knowing? Maybe the athletes didn't want to know because they wanted to continue to play.
Well, I think there is some of that, to be sure. But as I said before, the parents have to weigh in on this. And there's a growing awareness that we can do a lot to save these kids. It doesn't mean they're disqualified. They might get an internal defibrillator, which allows them to continue to play.
Right.
Yeah, so it's not necessarily a DQ
Game
for these kids.
over.
Yeah, it's not. But it can be a lifesaver for these kids.
It's just alarming to me that we're not hearing about it. The only thing that we really hear about is that someone passed away.
Yes.
Nothing about what we're doing to prevent it. I don't think that's mainstream. That pivotal information is not mainstream. Parents don't know that there's options to get them tested.
Correct, yes.
And so I feel like these interviews are really important to bring that to the parents' awareness as well.
Right.
So walk me through the process of when you would use Cardea 2020. How does this look?
Okay. So the youngster comes in, sits on a table or lays down on a table. We put electrodes across their chest. So we put electrodes on both arms and on both legs. And then we put 6 electrodes across the chest. So it takes maybe 5 minutes to undress and put these things on.
Okay.
And then the ECG records for 16 seconds. It's a short recording time. And then you take electrodes off, and the next kid walks in and do it again. The standard ECGs that are out there, they're always 10 seconds long. But these kids are what we call bradycardic. They have very slow heart rates because they're so fit. And so we extended the recording time so that we could get more beats, which we can then put together and get more accuracy on the beat itself. So our electronics are a little bit special so that we can really focus on recording very high quality data for these youngsters.
Yeah, tell me a little bit about what sets you apart from other competitors.
Nobody else has implemented the criteria, so that's pretty big step, yeah. So we have a very high sampling rate, very accurate. We measure like a microvolt, a millionth of a volt is our level of sensitivity, so it's extremely sensitive. We sample it twice what everybody else does, so we have a lot more data. And then the algorithms that support the criteria are the keys. Yeah.
And the machine is small.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's handheld.
Like we've got one here in the studio.
We'll have to show you one.
Yeah, we have one here in the studio. It's not something you can put it in your car.
Yeah, you can. Yeah, actually, one of our first customers was the Brewers baseball team.
Oh, really?
This is 10 years ago. And they would take it to South America in a suitcase, and they would use it when they were recruiting. The kid got an ECG before
wow.
he got a contract.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
We will be uploading many more videos to help educate and bring awareness to cardiac insight and heart health. So if you enjoy these videos, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.